Just wait for that to start. Okay, perfect. All right, so I'm going to hand over to Martin Holbrad, who's going to give his taster lecture over what is anthropology and why the world needs it. And then Fiona and Joe are also on the call, who work at UCL and can answer any questions you might have more generally about UCL after Martin's finished. So if you have any questions for Martin, please do pop them in the chat, or feel free to ask when he's finished. And then if you've got more general questions about UCL processes and admissions and that sort of thing, Fiona and Joe will be happy to help. So that's all from me, and I'll hand over to you, Martin.
Thank you very much. Let me try and share my screen, which is always a perilous exercise, but perhaps it is working. Can you confirm that that's okay? Perfect.
Yeah,
Okay.
working.
Thank you. So hi, everyone. Sorry if there's a bit of background noise. I'm in London South Bank Centre, which is on the southern shore of the Thames River, and it's a kind of public space. I come here to work sometimes. My name is Martin Holbrad, and I work in the anthropology department of UCL. And I'm positively evangelical about anthropology and how important it is. So that's going to be the topic of my talk today. This is not an entirely innocent choice on my part. It's also because I'm just launching a new master's program called Anthropology and Professional Practice, which is dedicated precisely to training students at master's level who are interested not only in anthropology for its own sake as an intellectual pursuit, but also for the difference it can make to different professional fields and practices. So how does thinking and acting as an anthropologist, kind of taking on board anthropological concepts, methods, and so on, help you get on in your career, say, for example, in policy making or in business or in the NGO sector, in development and in medical fields and so on. That's really the kind of remit of this new master's course that we're running. I realize a lot of you are from America. In the United States, there is quite a buoyant kind of field of applied anthropology. And if you like, this is a version of that. Surprisingly, there's not much of that in postgraduate training in Britain. So UCL is actually leading the pack in establishing this program in our department. And we're really, really excited to be doing it. So I can talk a bit in the questions more about the program. What I'm actually going to do now is really make a kind of intellectual case, if you like, for such a program. For why, as I say, I'm evangelical about the importance of anthropology and its contribution to the world. And I'll do that by precisely following what I say in the title, spending some time explaining what anthropology actually is, because I think a lot of people don't actually know what anthropology is. I certainly, if taxi drivers are anything to go by, I think a lot of people think it's vaguely about bones or sometimes about spiders. I get that, or insects in general. The first answer is somewhat true in the sense that biological or physical anthropology, as it's sometimes called, is about human evolution and does go into paleoanthropology and the study of bones and so on. That's not the kind of anthropology I'm going to talk about. And certainly I'm not going to talk about any anthropology that is about insects, unless it's about how people engage with insects, which is, of course, fine for an anthropological topic. I'll be talking about what in America is called, is often referred to as cultural anthropology, and we in Britain sometimes called social anthropology. It's roughly the same thing. So that's going to be the focus of the larger part of my talk, is what is that? And then I'm going to end with some thoughts about why I think it's so important. I'll try and persuade you of that case. Okay. So the first thing to say really about anthropology is that there's no single satisfactory definition of it, right? There's a huge kind of debate within anthropology, as there is, for example, within philosophy, about what anthropology is. And if you get 2 or 3 anthropologists in a room, you probably get a kind of heated disagreement about what the point of the discipline is, right? So and that's kind of sometimes frustrating for people, for students, and so on. Or it's also an indication of the energy that there is in the discipline, right? But kinds of definitions that people might come up with is something like the comparative study of what it is to be human, or the study of social and cultural phenomena, but based on ethnographic fieldwork, and I'll explain what that is in a minute. So people will say kind of very broad things of this kind, and they're all correct in some way. But the problem with them is that they don't really distinguish very clearly from other related disciplines, right? So If you want to say that anthropology is the comparative study of what it is to be human, well, biologists might say the same, or at least biologists who are interested in the human body. Sociologists would certainly want to say something similar. Economists might even go so far as to say that. So it doesn't really pick out anthropology very clearly. Similarly, the study of social and cultural phenomena, well, a lot of disciplines that would claim to have a kind of stake in the study of that, right? And indeed, even if you start pointing to this methodology that we have, which is ethnographic fieldwork, and I will explain more about it in a minute, that it is a kind of flagship of our discipline as a discipline, it's actually the case that more and more other disciplines than anthropology are now doing ethnography, notably sociologists, management studies people, a whole array of different disciplines are using this methodology in order to get their data, right? So even that doesn't really work as a definition, right? So what I like to say when I try to explain to people what makes anthropology distinctive is that it is indeed all of the above, all of the things that I just said, but with the difference, and this is a colleague of mine called Phil Burnham, who actually happens to be American, who said this to me a long time ago, and I really loved it as a definition. It really kind of hit the spot for me. The difference is that in anthropology, the people that we study, right, are deliberately given a role in defining the questions that we ask about them, right? So there's this kind of interesting feedback loop that characterizes anthropological ways of thinking and researching and asking questions, whereby the questions that we ask about social and cultural phenomena, like historians do, like cultural students do, or whatever, are influenced by the way that the people involved in those phenomena think about them, right? It's a funny kind of computer scientists might call this a recursive feedback loop, which I think is distinctive to the way that anthropologists operate. Now I'm trying to change my slide. Yeah. Now let me give you an example, right? Now I've designed this example specifically for today because I know that you guys are all interested in the idea of either sending students or you yourself might be a student working in the United States and considering doing a postgraduate degree at the UK, right? Now, actually, why people might want to do that is a perfectly legitimate and interesting social scientific questions that many disciplines might have a stake in trying to answer, right? So why do people in the US, applicants from the US doing an undergraduate degree at a US university, consider studying abroad, particularly in the UK, for their postgraduate studies? That's the kind of thing that you might do a social scientific study of different kinds. Now, say that you're a sociologist, right? Might legitimately ask this question. How would you approach or go about studying this question? Well, this might be a bit of a caricature, but I think it's broadly right as a kind of very generalized explanation. First, you define your term. So who is a student for a start, for example, right? Then you try to identify some relevant social trends that might influence these choices on the part of American students to study in Britain. And these might be statistical, they might be variegated according to gender or class or ethnicity or age groups and so on, right? Then you might go on to try and identify some societal factors, given that you're a sociologist, right? If you're an economist, it might be an economic factor, right? That might explain these trends, right? So, for example, is there an expected rise in the income levels of people going abroad to study for postgraduate degrees, right? How do these choices correlate to changes in US government policy or indeed British government policy? Is there a shift in public discourse that might explain some of the forces and factors that are pushing American students to consider studying in the UK, right? Those are the kinds of things that a sociologist might ask. Now, I only set this up, as I say, slightly caricaturish example as a point of contrast to show you what an anthropologist might do when they were studying a similar question, right? The first thing that an anthropologist would do would be to situate their research within a group of students in the US. So typically, if a student of mine was doing a project about this topic, I would say, listen, what you've got to do is you've got to go hang out for a long time in a dorm of a US university, right? Hang out with local students and try and get under the skin and understand how they're thinking about these problems. I apologize, but there's some music in the background over which I have no control. So you're going to have to live with that. I hadn't anticipated this. So apologies for that. So first of all, you live and hang out with those very students that you're trying to understand. That's the first thing. And that, by the way, is that bit that I mentioned before about the ethnography, right? And the purpose of doing that is try to identify the students' own relevant ideas, assumptions, concerns, expectations, fears, aspirations, and so on, by spending long, good quality time with them, right? So how do they relate to each other in daily life? How does their choice to go to a foreign university in Britain get feature in their daily lives, in the conversations that they have? What assumptions underpin those conversations, of which they themselves might not even be aware, for example, right? Why does this choice of becoming a student at a postgraduate level even matter to them? These are the kinds of questions that anthropologists are peculiarly attuned to when they go about doing their research, right? So what you're trying to do in kind of spending this deep qualitative time, deep hanging out, as a famous anthropologist from America said, and I'll say something about that in a minute, with those students help you to do, it helps you develop a picture of what this question of why people pursue postgraduate studies in the UK is important from those students' own point of view. I'll come back to this question of perspective or point of view in a minute, right? Now, you can explore the ways in which the various factors that the sociologist or the putative sociologist that I was talking about earlier is interested in. You can explore the ways that these factors might be part of this picture, right? So, for example, the economic situation or policy changes or whatever might all be things that are informing the ways that the students themselves see those choices, right? But crucially, by doing field work and spending time with them, ethnographic field work, as I say, you might also reveal the ways in which those students' point of view might go beyond the things that you would expect to find, beyond the preconceived analytical assumptions that you might make if you were studying the phenomenon from the outside, as a sociologist does, right? So your engagement with those students' own point of view might have the power and capacity to shift your own point of view in how you think about the question that you're asking. And that moment, that shifting moment, is, I think, the characteristic signature moment of anthropological research and thinking. That's really the point that I want to drive home. Let me see if I can change the slide again. Yes, great. So I've mentioned this Greek word ethnography, from ethnos and grapho, writing about the ethnic group, whatever that is. And I mentioned this expression due to this famous Princeton anthropologist, Clifford Geertz, who died a few years back, deep hanging out. But what is ethnographic fieldwork? Let me say a little bit more about that. So ethnographic fieldwork is indeed the flagship of social and cultural anthropology, but not just, as sometimes sociologists and other colleagues in other social sciences think, because it provides good qualitative data, because it does that. You get a lot of rich life stories, experiences, anecdotes, and so on by hanging out in a student dorm for 3 months, as you would have to answer the question, as I said before, right? So you get nice qualitative data, but that's not distinctive about anthropology, the way that anthropology uses ethnography. It's not just the source of ethnographic data, but it also allows the lives of the people that we're studying, as I said before, to help us set the terms of the way in which we study them, right? It allows us to make that shift that I was talking about before, that close engagement, right? And it makes a virtue of the fact that social research, anthropological research in this case, is itself conducted through the management of a social relationship between the researcher and the people that the researcher is researching, right? They used to be called informants. Today, they're usually called respondents or interlocutors, right? So those students in that dorm and I, as a researcher or my student, enter into a social relationship that is of a kind with the social relationships between those students that I'm trying to understand as an anthropologist, the way that they think and operate, right? So that social relationship between the researcher and the research becomes the ground out of which our anthropological knowledge about the phenomena that we're interested in grows, right? We learn about social relationships through establishing social relationships. That's very different from what an economist, a sociologist, a historian, etc. might do, right? So you might say that anthropological research is inherently comparative as well as empathic, right? It's a very peculiar form of empathy. I use that term because it's quite a kind of current term at present, I think, empathy, right? So anthropological knowledge and research and insight emerges in the tension between 2 points of view: my point of view as an anthropologist and what Malinowski, a very old school anthropologist, in fact, the kind of grandfather of social anthropology in Britain back in 1922, called the natives point of view. That's when anthropology used to be primarily a colonial pursuit. We'll talk about that if you want a little bit later, the kind of the historical roots, some quite problematic in some ways, historical roots of the discipline before, right? So people used to imagine the people that anthropologists study as being natives. That's colonial terminology, which basically just means people born in a particular place, right? But it has this colonial kind of resonance to it. So Malinowski was talking of anthropology as the attempt by the anthropologist to grasp the native's point of view, right? Now, that word is not a word that we would use today, but it's still about grasping someone else's point of view. And that someone else could be my neighbor in South London, or it could be someone in Cuba, which is where I happen to work as an anthropologist myself in Havana, or it could be someone in southern Milwaukee or wherever it might be, right? Doesn't matter where they are. There's still someone whose perspective we're interested in as anthropologists, right? So there's this kind of inherently comparative and empathic relationship between 2 points of view in the conduct of anthropology. And it's that the tension between those 2 points of view that makes what we do, I think, peculiarly interesting and revealing. So I often talk about anthropology and its method of ethnography as a kind of rigorous form of empathy. And that is captured in the way that people often gloss this kind of flagship methodology of ours, ethnography, which is the method of participant observation. Note the paradoxical um, formulation, right? You're both participating in something, which involves going into it, being part of it, and at the same time you're observing it, which suggests a certain distance from which you're gaining a perspective on it, right? This kind of crucial, uncomfortable tension is at the heart of what we do as anthropologists, right? And the inherently comparative and empathic nature of what we do is expressed in that paradox, right? So during fieldwork, we participate in the lives of the people that we study in order to see things from their point of view, to live life as if we were wearing their shoes, if you like, right? So we go into the phenomenon, but at the same time, we strive to observe what's going on, right? Even while we're participating, and thus establishing our own points of view in relation to theirs, right? We're not just assimilating ourselves into the point of view of the people that we're studying, but we're at the same time, maintaining that critical distance in order to understand what's going on, if you like, right? Now, let me just qualify this just a little bit. So when we're talking about our point of view as anthropologists here, we're not just talking about our personal point of view as particular people. So I'm Martin Holbrand. I've got a particular positionality, as people would say, in present debates about these things. So I'm a white European in terms of ethnicity. I'm male. I have cisgender orientation. I have a particular political positioning, and so on. All of these specific contingent things about me as a person, of course, go in to constitute that perspective that I'm developing as an anthropologist. And they are, of course, relevant, and I always have to be very kind of aware of them and reflexive about them as I conduct my research. This is a very hot debate at present in relation to questions of kind of inequality, racism, colonial and decolonization dynamics within the discipline, and so on, right? But it's important to make the point that in developing our perspective in this anthropological guise that I'm talking about, we're talking about our own perspective as anthropologists, which means the whole body of knowledge that we bring to bear on that relationship of understanding that we're trying to establish with the people that we're trying to understand, right? It's not just my personal predilections as a human being that are at issue here, but also my predilections as an anthropologist, the traditions of debate, of thought, of conceptual orientations, and so on, that my discipline has developed that I'm trying to bring into relationship with that point of view of the people that I'm trying to understand, right? So if you like, ethnographic and anthropological research is comparative and empathic in 2 senses. There's the comparison between myself as an anthropologist and the people that I'm studying as an anthropologist, but there's also the comparison between the people that I'm studying and all the other people that other anthropologists have studied, and through the study of whom the body of anthropological knowledge that we know and love, or at least I love very much, has grown, right? And I've got to bring these things into relationship with each other in order to make gain some insight and create that kind of tension between perspectives that I'm talking about. Okay, my last kind of set of points about trying to explain how ethnographic research works would focus on the question of holism, right? And how that works. This holistic approach that anthropologists typically take into the ethnographic encounter through which they build up their knowledge, what I've been talking about, which I imagine as piecing together a kind of jigsaw puzzle of people's lives, right? So the mixture of participation and observation that I talked about is what makes ethnographic fieldwork deep, in the sense that Clifford Geertz was talking about when he said that anthropology is about deep hanging out, right? We go beyond what just people say explicitly about what they do, and that's why ethnographic research is so much deeper, for example, than just conducting interviews or doing focus groups, as so much social research does, right? And we seek to reveal the premises, the categories, the assumptions, the concerns that people have, often in a way that they're entirely unaware of, right? Because you're trying to get under the skin of people's lives, not just kind of ask the surface kind of responses that they may have and the questions that you're interested in, but by spending long quality time with them, begin to understand the dynamics that underpin the opinions that they come up with, or the tensions that they embed themselves with in their social relationships and so on, right? So we're trying to embed ourselves in people's lives through this process of participant observation that I talked about, right? So ethnographic research is holistic in that sense, that word holistic coming again from the Greek holon, which means the whole, right? So you're trying to piece together different aspects of people's lives. And it's interesting, like, just to go back to the example, trying to work out why American students might want to come to the UK to study, just for the sake of argument, I'm making this up as I go along right now, you might imagine spending a whole evening with a student and you're discussing that choice with them. And it emerges as you're spending the evening that the tension that comes up most in them when they think about this are the expectations that their parents have of them. And suddenly you begin to realize that people, as an anthropologist, that people's choice as to where to go to study has a lot to do with the roles that they perform in relation to what, as anthropologists, we would call kinship, right? Your role as a son or as a daughter, or as a parent yourself if you have children and you're a mature student, right? And how you juggle those things in relation to the choices that you're making, right? So suddenly you're beginning to establish kind of these transversal, lateral connections, unexpected connections between things that might pertain to the field of education and professional choices, and very personal things that might have to do with, even at the psychoanalytic level, with the relationship with your parents and so on, right? Anthropologists are very characteristically kind of agile in making those lateral connections in an effort to piece together this jigsaw puzzle together with their interlocutors and respondents in that kind of social engagement that ethnographic research involves, right? Good. So this was a kind of very quick and I hope contentful but not very extensive attempt to explain what I think is distinctive about the way that anthropologists think and what it is that we do. Let me very quickly now, in 3 or 4 minutes, give you a kind of argument about why I think this is an important activity. The first thing that I would say, and I would say this to any audience, is that, of course, this is an incredibly important as well as exciting intellectual activity that is worth its own sake, beyond any kind of further utility that it might have, right? It's simply a kind of addition to the armory of human curiosity, if you like, this way of doing research, right? By definition, by exposing ourselves to the perspectives of other people, and being open to the possibility that their perspectives might exceed our expectations, might go beyond our own perspectives on things, that we might learn new ways of imagining what it is to be human, what it is to be alive, right? By engaging with those perspectives, we're ipso facto, by that very fact, we're opening up new windows of possibility for thinking, right? And the history of anthropology as a discipline is, the way that I teach it, the way that I think of it, is the history of these openings of windows, right? There's a new way of thinking about what it is to be a parent by exposing yourself to the way that people go about being parents in southern India, right? Or southern states, United States, right? And how people connect being a parent to the engagement with the environment and their extraction of resources in order to produce food, right? That lateral connection between random things that seem to be, connected to in different ways and pertaining to different disciplines. The anthropologist brings them together in this holistic way and gives us a proposition about some new way of imagining what it is to be a father, for example, right? No other discipline does that. Philosophers might try to do that, but they're sterile compared to anthropologists, because anthropologists do it through the engagement with human beings rather than abstract speculation in the library. I don't want to mischaracterize what philosophers do, but I think a lot of their time is spent in the library. There's a lot of our time is spent in a dorm in Milwaukee or wherever it was, right? Good. So there's an intellectual value in what we do that I think is sui generis and should not be underestimated. But actually, I want to add to that three further reasons why I think anthropology is particularly important, and not least right now in the way that the world is, as I at least perceive it, right? The first one is downright political, right? I defined anthropology before as a rigorous form of empathy. And, you know, you don't have to be a kind of wet liberal, as I probably am, I have to admit, in order to feel that right now the world is excessively polarized, that people are shouting at each other and often seem to enjoy being cruel towards each other. And I'm not only referring to political debates and the echo chambers that divide countries like my own and your own down the middle right now, or Turkey, or we just had elections in Turkey right now, very similar divisions across the board, it feels. India, similar, etc. Any form of systematic opening towards other people, to me, cannot but be an important step towards addressing what to me is the most profoundly troubling development of our times, this inability to listen and this proclivity towards cruel polarization, right? And that goes for whichever side you might feel that you belong on, right? So I think anthropology is a way of introducing students to ways of thinking that can counteract these very noxious, obnoxious, and toxic dynamics that seem to be all around us at the moment, right? Connected to this, but I call this, it's kind of spins the point more in the ethical direction. I think that it's really important to think of anthropology as a form, or anthropological sensibilities and ways of thinking, as ways of redressing questions of marginalization, questions of inequality, ways in which certain voices, certain perspectives are way more dominant in the world and way more powerful than others, and the way that that power reproduces itself and crushes and kind of it takes the oxygen away from alternative perspectives. So anthropology is all about listening very carefully and providing openings for other perspectives to express themselves and to make a difference, not just to express themselves, but to make a difference to those perspectives that are powerful, right? So anthropology is positioned in a powerful position because it is part of structures such as elite universities like UCL, or the American university system and so on, which are underpinned by centuries of inequality, colonial exploitation, neo-colonial structures of all sorts of kinds, right? The very fact that a place like UCL, which is in a kind of colonial metropolis, is able to attract students from across the world, whereas a university in Athens, where I grew up in Greece, is unable to do so. Universities in other important capitals of the world that are in the periphery rather than in the colonial centers find it well nigh impossible to fund themselves due to the kind of lack of interest by international students from the United States, such as yourselves and the people that you represent, right? These dynamics are, of course, political economic dynamics that have a long history, and their reproduction depends to a large extent in the continuation of marginalizing certain perspectives at the expense of others, right? In favor of others. Anthropology is one way of redressing these imbalances because it has a voice within the center, but it's an opening of that window, as I said, to other possibilities. Those other possibilities don't need to be the other side of the world. They might be down the road from where we live, but they're still beyond the realm of the power structures in which universities are embedded, and therefore can be allowed to make a difference to those structures. So there's an ethical response that anthropology is able to give to the question of marginalization and unequal distributions of power. And finally, and just as importantly and related to this, there's an extremely strong and good pragmatic reason for making such a move, this move of rigorous empathy. And that is that to me, it seems unfathomable how anyone can imagine they could do anything in terms of policy, in terms of business, in terms of product development, in terms of user research or whatever, without engaging with the kinds of deep methodologies that anthropology has to offer, right? There's a fantastic trained anthropologist who then went on to become the editor at large of the Financial Times, Gillian Tett. She's written a fantastic book called Anthrovision, which makes the argument that I'm making right now, where she says, for example, that whole businesses like Lego, for example, the toy company, or the response to the pandemic. Her book was written before COVID or just at the time of COVID, so she was talking about the Ebola pandemic slightly earlier than COVID. What an important difference anthropological input made to the way that these policies and these business propositions were developed, right? So effectively, a group of anthropologists pretty much turned around the fortunes of Lego to make it one of the most dominant businesses in the toy sector right now. Similarly, across policy, across anything that has to do with understanding the perspective of other people and what doesn't have something to do with that, surely must benefit from the kind of empathic rigor that anthropological methods and training and ways of approaching things have to offer, right? So there's a really strong pragmatic reason to be trained in anthropology. I feel positively evangelical about this, and that's precisely what this new course that I mentioned at the very beginning, Anthropology and Professional Practice, is all about, is helping students understand how to do this kind of research and bring it to bear, apply it to the different professional fields in which they're interested in pursuing their careers. Okay, that's my argument, guys. I hope it's been in some way helpful and illuminating, and I would very much be keen to hear any questions you may have. Be delighted to respond.
Thank you, Martin. That was brilliant. I certainly, as a UCL member of staff, learnt a lot. So, in terms of sort of your program, how sort of does what you're sort of talking about there? Like, how is your program sort of different? How are you sort of using what you've talked about today in your masters, the new masters that you've got coming out?
Very good question. Sorry for the delay. My keyboard is sticky. Yes. So basically, what we've been doing until now is we've been trying to embed the kind of stuff that I've been talking about in a straight academic program in social and cultural anthropology. I mean, we've got lots of master's programs in our department. We've got digital anthropology, we've got medical anthropology, we've got all sorts of things, right? But in the realm of kind of social and cultural anthropology that I've been talking about, we've been running a program like any good anthropology department in any part of the world has, right? A master's program in social cultural anthropology. And we've been trying to embed within an essentially academic training, right? As if, like, the best thing that could possibly happen to our students is that they become versions of ourselves, because we, of course, chose to become academics. So we teach that program as if, like, the best thing that could happen, the best outcome is that they apply to do a PhD and then to become lecturers and professors in anthropology, right? And that's over the years it's become clear to me that that's increasingly unfit for purpose and inadequate for a good proportion of the students who take masters in anthropology, and who understand that actually the value that they get out of it is in taking those ways of thinking, as I was saying before, and utilizing them in business, in policy making, in the civil service, in politics, or whatever it might be, right? So we've decided with this program to really embrace that. And the way that we do that is really, I mean, there's a number of ways, but the two key ones are these. First of all, we begin in term one, or with one term in which we give students the rudiments of anthropological thinking, the kind of stuff that I've been talking about. What is society? What is culture? How do we think about hierarchy? What is it to be a person? And so on. But rather than just thinking of these as kind of intellectual questions that anthropologists have tried to engage through different kind of ways, we do that, but we try already from term one to relate that to the student's own professional and institutional experiences. Right? So what is it to be a person? Well, let's read about how you define your brand as a self when you're applying for jobs in the United States, right? So how does writing a CV reflect your personhood, anthropologically, right? So you're transposing the question to the questions about professional practice that our students are interested in already from term one. But the emphasis there is in making them learn these concepts and kind of particular ways of thinking about these things, right? And then in term two, we in a way kind of roll up our shirt sleeves, or whatever the expression is, by literally looking at the different ways anthropologists working in different professional fields are utilizing anthropological knowledge. So each week will be, okay, anthropology in user experience research, and we're bringing in a guest lecturer that I interview. It's a 4-hour seminar. It's really taxing. For the first hour, I'll be interviewing and taking questions, just like you guys are doing with me right now. Someone who works in user experience research, but who has anthropological training. The following week, someone who's working in design. The following week, someone working in policy making. The following week, someone who's working in consultancy and business consultancy. So we're covering kind of 7, 8 different professional fields, and the students are assessed by doing a kind of client-facing project pitch, where they use anthropological research to solve a problem of, in this case, an imaginary client, right? Someone that they find, they work up a topic relating to kind of media story or something like that, right? A desk-based project, which then prepares them finally for their final project, which is worth 50% of their grade. So it's a massive kind of component of the program, and that takes place from the end of term 2 until the end of the program. So it's basically 6 months teaching and 6 months doing the final project, 50-50. Where each student has on the one hand, an academic supervisor, and where relevant, an industry mentor. So we kind of get people in from industry to support students, where they actually do a client-facing project. So they sit, for example, with an NGO based in London, trying to help them understand better how to support local communities in Northern England to access employability and skill services, making this up, right? Or they sit in a tech startup and try and use ethnographic methods to help people understand better their potential customers, right? And we support people in doing these projects. And the final outcome of those projects is not an academic dissertation, as usually is for our master's programs. Typically, a student will write a kind of 18,000 words dissertation, and that's their kind of project. We do a deck of slides, a really big deck of slides, which is again client facing, which the student has to present, and they get graded on that, right? Alongside an essay that reflects on how that client facing project is informed by anthropological methods and concepts, right? So there's a kind of 75% is the project, and 25% is the essay that students write about the project. So we keep the academic and the applied going alongside each other. So it's really very radically different to the way that we normally do our masters in anthropology. There's no other masters like it in the UK. Yeah, I'm really excited about it. And I should say one other thing, just as a piece of information that our American audience might not be aware of. UCL has got a new campus in, so traditionally UCL is based in the centre of London in a place called Bloomsbury, which is a kind of very leafy, posh bit of London. But since the Olympics, there's this thing called the Olympic Park in East London, which has been developed since the Olympics with all sorts of institutions kind of developing new initiatives there. UCL has got a stake there, and our program will be based there. It will be based at UCL East. And the reason for that is that UCL East, that new campus in East London, is very much oriented towards interface with industry and interface with local communities. That's the whole ethos of UCL East. So rather than the kind of ivory tower image of university as a kind of, place where you just bury yourself in the library and think big thoughts, UCL East is a kind of space of engagement. And this program is really about that kind of engagement. So it finds its natural home in UCL East. And I think that's really exciting as well. But there will be classes taught in Bloomsbury, so it's not like you don't get to participate in the Bloomsbury campus too. I hope that gives you a sense.
Yeah, great. We've just had a question come in as well on the chat. So it says, as you review applicants to your program, what undergraduate backgrounds are you particularly watching out for? And then Brenda said also, thank you for your talk, immensely informative and interesting.
Oh, cool. Thank you very much for your kind words. So we're completely open. We don't have, I have applicants from, natural sciences. I just reviewed an application this morning from an engineer or someone who's majored in engineering in China. We have applicants who studied anthropology already but want to specialize. We have applicants who studied literature or journalism or media. We're completely open. What I really would say for this particular program is that I lay great store and spend a lot of time reading the personal statement, because I really want to convince myself that this student is really interested in this interface between anthropology and professional practice. And it's often happened that I receive an application from someone who basically wants to learn anthropology. And I say, listen, fantastic application, but this is not what this program just does. It's really interested in that interface. We have a problem, a problem, maybe that was a Freudian slip, a program that teaches, anthropology for its own sake. It's our social and cultural anthropology program. So why don't you apply there, right? Or I had another student another applicant, I should say, who spent the whole personal statement talking about medical applications of anthropology. And it struck me that they should really be studying medical anthropology, because they were very, very specifically focused on that, right? So again, I advised them, listen, just apply for this other program that we have. I think you're better suited to that. So I really spend a lot of time trying to make sure that the student will benefit from this particular focus that this program has. And I'm particularly, of course, interested in people's professional engagement. So if someone says to me, I spent last summer, working for a media company, and I spend a lot of time thinking about, what do the people who actually watch the cartoons that my company was producing, what are they actually looking for in these cartoons, right? That's an anthropological question. That for me is like, okay, this is the kind of person I want for the program. Right? I don't know if that helps.
Just to add as well, generally from the US, we're sort of looking for a minimum of a 3.3 GPA. I'm sure if all your students are looking at some of these scholarships, I'm sure they'll be doing far better than a 3.3 GPA. But just sort of across UCL, that's the sort of general area that we look for nearly all of our master's programs. So you should find if they're getting that, then they're good to go in terms of the academics. And then, as Martin said, we will then be looking at personal statements to make sure the student is, the applicant is going to do well for the program that they're applying to.
Yeah.
Is there any more questions? We've been here for 45 minutes now, so I don't know whereabouts in the States most of you are, or in the world, but it's sort of getting towards 5:45 here in the evening. So if there aren't any more questions, I'm sure we're all happy to, in the UK, start our evenings and let everybody else get on with the rest of their day. I'll just give it another moment. But thank you so much, Martin. That was so interesting and really, really informative for me as well. So thank you for giving up your time. And I can see we've got a few thank yous coming in the chat. So I'm sure people that were in attendance were learnt lots as well.
Great.
Yeah,
It's been a pleasure.
thank you, Martin. I learned a lot as well. It was great. So thanks so much for sharing your time and your knowledge on anthropology. It was really beneficial. And thanks, Fiona, as well for joining. And Joe, just let you know that if you did say that you're happy to be contacted afterwards on the RSVP, I'll share your details with Fiona, who I'm sure will get in touch with you. So if you did have any follow-up questions on Martin's program or UCL as a whole, I'm sure that's there'll be plenty of opportunity to ask them at a later stage if one pops in your head as the day goes on. So thanks again, everyone, for coming. And I'm sure I'll see some of you soon, and hopefully Martin and Fiona see you in London as well. So thanks, everyone.